Bunga ng pagbubuti ng OPAP against corruption, ginawa rin ito ng Commission of Audit ng unqualified opinion dahil sa maayos na presentasyon ng aming mga financial statement. Ito po yung pinaka-highest na qualification na binibigay po ng COA. Dahil dito, nakakuha kami ng gradong 95% at nagawaran bilang isa sa mga Most Outstanding Accounting Office Award ng Association of Government Accountants of the Philippines Incorporated ngayong taon. Nabigyan din ang OPAP ng Performance Governance System Initiated Status with the Gold Trailblazer Award ng Institute for Solidarity in Asia dahil sa naipakitang kapasidad na i-operationalize ang public governance system. Next slide, please. Mr. President, upang mas lalong mapabuti ang aming serbisyo, kasalukuyang nagdaraan ito sa Performance Governance System Compliance Stage. Gayon din ang Quality Management System or ISO certification. Nagpapatupad ang Information System Strategic Plan 2019-2023 sa naaprobado ng mithi at pinagbubuti ng aming business policies, protocols, and processes based on the Directive on ARTA, on Against Red Tape. Ang lahat ng ito ay sa paghahanda ng transformation ng OPAP para maging Office of the Presidential Advisor on Peace, Reconciliation, and Unity sa pamamagitan ng proposed Executive Order on OPAP. Next slide, please. Bilang tugon sa programa ng pamahalaan laban sa COVID-19, kabilang ang OPAP na tumutulong sa National Task Force Against COVID-19 at National COVID-19 Vaccination Program. Mr. President, in a nutshell, your leadership has inspired us and enabled us to achieve these milestones. Since 2017, the country's peace process helped establish a stability in the domestic peace and order situation. Despite the challenges brought about by the pandemic, the peace process in the country continues to be implemented. The implementation of the peace agreement is transforming former combatants and their families into peaceful and productive individuals, and conflict-affected communities to peaceful, developed, and resilient communities. And the Duterte administration established a strong foundation in the implementation of the signed peace agreement for the next administration to build upon and sustain the gains of peace, particularly in Mindanao. Mahal na Pangulo, nangangako po ang OPAP na patuloy nitong itataguyod ang kapayapaan, pag-uunawaan at pagkakaisa. Sisiguruhin namin po ang lahat na napakaloob ng kasunduang pangkapayapaan ay maisa sa katuparan. And rest assured, Mr. President, yung challenges po kanina ay isosolving po natin yon because pupunta po ako bukas sa Cotabato ng 2 araw at aayusin natin yung ground para maging matahimik po ang eleksyon sa susunod na eleksyon next year. So that's my commitment, Mr. President, that I will do my best at isosolve namin po ang problema sa ground with the help of Secretary Delfin Lorzana and Secretary Anyo. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Salamat, Secretary Galvez. Let me introduce you to Father Austriaco. Father, si Secretary Galvez was the commander noon sa Marawi. Right after the Marawi siege, I got him into the cabinet. He's one of the many military members. Here with us is Secretary Lorenzana, who's the DND and the DILG, si Secretary Anyo. All excellent government workers and true gentlemen. Out of respect for the time of Father Austriaco, unahin ka na lang namin, Father, kasi matagal to. Because every cabinet member is going to, we don't want to detain you more than the necessary tokatis na ano. Mahaba kasi kung iba, malayo ka pa, unahin ka na namin. So we will listen to you the Omicron variant of SARS COVID V2 because that has been the scare of the nation until now. Father, kindly educate us about the Omicron variant and so that we would know.
Thank you po, Mr. President. And I am a Filipino Catholic priest scientist, and I'm speaking to you from the United States. So this evening, I've been asked to brief you po on the Omicron variant of SARS-CoV-2, and I would like to highlight some of the most recent clinical data that we have obtained from South Africa. So the next slide, please. I would like to begin by just giving you a perspective on a current assessment on the COVID-19 pandemic in the Philippines. I am a molecular biologist, so I would like to give you a sense of my perception of the pandemic. Next slide, please. As you pointed out at the beginning of the cabinet meeting, we are experiencing the lowest case numbers in 20 months, with an average of about 500 cases per day. I would like to contrast that with here in the United States. Yesterday, we had 120,000 new cases, and the United States is only 3 times the size of the Philippines. Next slide, please. What is also striking is that we are also experiencing the lowest hospitalization numbers in 20 months. Earlier today, Makati Med announced for the first time during the pandemic, they have no COVID-19 patients in their hospital. And this is typical of many hospitals throughout our beloved country. Next slide, please. But this is also interesting because we are experiencing the highest mobility in 20 months. So this is a graph from Apple Mobility, and the higher the curves, the more people are moving around. And what you can see, this is the mobility trends from the NCR. What you can see is that many of our people are moving around now the most in 20 months since the beginning of the pandemic and the lockdown in March of 2020. Next slide, please. And so as a biologist, this is the question. We are currently with Delta, the most infectious variant in the past 20 months, the highest mobility levels in the past 20 months. More and more of our kababayans are moving around. And yet, we are experiencing the lowest levels of cases and hospitalizations in 20 months. And so what these three mean together is that it suggests that we have attained substantial population immunity from natural infections and vaccinations in the urban areas of the Philippines. Because the pandemic has raged and spread primarily in our cities and in our first-class municipalities. And so the fact that the virus is struggling to find new Filipinos to infect suggests that we have attained substantial population immunity. Next slide, please. This is to compare the Philippines with 3 of our ASEAN neighbors. So if you look, the lowest graph is the Philippines, and we are at 500 cases per day. You can see Thailand and Malaysia had the Delta surge earlier than we did, but their surge has not been able to crash. So at this time, Thailand and Malaysia are still experiencing 5,000 cases per day. Now, contrast that with Vietnam. Vietnam also had a Delta peak. Unfortunately, the Delta peak has resurged, and Vietnam is still experiencing some significant numbers of COVID-19, 15,000 or so per day. Now, the reason why these 4 different countries have experienced different pandemic curves is probably because, as you can see, the Philippines experienced, unlike these 3 other countries, substantial waves of previous variants. So especially the alpha beta variant, which struck our beloved country in March and April of this year. And so combining the vaccinations and the natural immunity, what you're seeing here is that many of our cities where the pandemic tends to focus are now stable enough to prevent transmission. Next slide, please. I just wanted to highlight this graph from the Financial Times, which illustrates the population immunity in different countries in Europe. On the left-hand side, you have Spain, which has about 90% of eligible population vaccinated. And the NCR and many of our urban cities have very similar vaccination levels. And what you can see on the left-hand side, if you focus on the red curve is the number of deaths. And what you can see is that the higher the population that is protected, the smaller the red curve. And across Europe, what you will notice is as the vaccination levels drop, the red curve begins to explode because the current wave that is flowing through Europe, which is Delta-driven, is still quite significant. At this time, given our significantly high numbers of vaccination, not only in the NCR, but in many of our cities, Secretary Vince just sent me the numbers for our cities and our first-class municipalities, and many of them are quite significant, above 70% for the first dose at least. What we're seeing here is that at least the NCR, with nearly 100% protection of the adults and with increasing numbers of our teenagers, is probably going to be robustly protected against the future surge. Next slide, please. We will now move to the COVID-19 Omicron threat to the Philippines, and I would like to begin as a biologist just to explain what Omicron is. Next slide, please. Here you see the best animation of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and on the surface of the virus, you see about 25 spike proteins, and these spike proteins are important because the virus uses the spike protein as a key to enter the cells of our body. Next slide, please. So for the duration of the pandemic, we had 4 important variants of concern: Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and Delta. Notice that we experienced Alpha, Beta, and Delta surges in the Philippines, but not really a significant Gamma surge. Next slide, please. We now have Omicron, and this makes the 5th of the important variants of concern. And the most significant change is that this virus, this version of the virus, has 50 plus mutations. Next slide, please. Let me explain. So different variants have different spike proteins. It is the same COVID-19 virus. It's the same SARS-CoV-2 virus, but different variants have different spike proteins. Next slide, please. And what you can see here is a comparison of the spike protein on the left of the Delta variant and the spike protein on the right of Omicron. Red indicates change. And as you can see, there are a few red spots in Delta, but on the right with Omicron, there is significant red, which means that the shape of the spike protein is different. And the reason that this is important po is because the antibodies in our blood recognize the shape of the spike protein. And so if the shape changes dramatically, this could mean that the virus is able to escape the immune protection that we have either from a previous infection of COVID-19 or from vaccination. Next slide, please. So what I would like to go over now is the clinical data that is coming out of South Africa. So this is the first graph from December 2nd. So it's only 4 days ago. And what you see on the left-hand side po is the daily cases comparing the Omicron wave with the previous waves that were experienced in South Africa. So the South Africa had a Delta wave, a Beta wave, and the first Wuhan wave, very similar to the Philippines. And what you can see that is most striking po is that the red line is very sharp and it's going up very quickly, which suggests that the Omicron wave is exploding in a way that is faster than the Delta or the Beta waves that we experienced in the past. The middle graph shows you the positivity rate. And again, what you're seeing here is that the Omicron variant is exploding in